Welcome to this custom deep dive. It's genuinely so great to have you with us today.
Yeah, really glad you're tuning in for this one.
Because today's mission, the journey we are about to go on together is, well, it's a massive one.
Huge.
We are going right to the very core of human existence. We're going to explore the concept of the self. And I mean that with a capital S.
Right.
Think about how often someone tells you to, know yourself, or how much time we spend trying to find ourselves. What does that actually mean?
It's a phrase we just throw around constantly.
Exactly. Is this self a real biological hidden object sitting inside your chest or your brain just waiting to be discovered like some buried treasure?
Or something else entirely.
Right. Could it be a historical invention, a concept that has been randomly patched together, stitched up, and reshaped over thousands of years?
It is arguably the most profound question a person can ask. And to answer it for you today, we have an incredibly rich stack of sources to work through.
A really dense stack.
Yeah, we are pulling insights primarily from the late French philosopher Michel Foucault. Specifically, we're focusing on his late-in-life seminars titled Technologies of the Self.
But we aren't stopping there.
No, definitely not. We're also diving deep into ancient texts, like Plato's famous dialogue Alcibiades the Sourced. And to bridge the ancient with the modern, we're bringing in some brilliant contemporary analyses.
We have Huck Gutman's breakdown of the 18th century philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
And Patrick H. Hutton's incredibly sharp historical essay comparing the wildly different worldviews of Sigmund Freud and Michel Foucault.
So we are literally covering a massive sweep of human history today to figure out how you became, well, you.
It's going to be quite the ride.
And to frame this entire overarching journey, I actually want to start with something completely unexpected from our source material, something that feels very far away from ancient Greece or 20th century French philosophy.
I love this part.
Let's talk about Turkish pop music.
Yes.
Specifically, the pop scene from the 1970s and 80s.
It is such a brilliant starting point.
Right. The sources point to artists like Semkaraka, Sezen Aksu, and later Yonka Evcimik. If you listen to their lyrics, you will constantly hear this specific phrase popping up.
Know yourself.
Exactly. But the sources highlight something completely fascinating about how this phrase is deployed in modern daily life, and not just in Turkey, but culturally across the board today.
Yeah, the context is totally different.
When these pop songs say, know yourself, or when someone points a finger at you in an argument and yells it, they are absolutely not telling you to go on a serene spiritual retreat to find your inner truth.
Not at all.
They are telling you to know your place.
Yeah.
They're saying stay in your lane, watch your mouth, or, don't step out of line.
Exactly. The modern colloquial usage of know yourself has essentially morphed into a tool of social control. As the text highlights, it operates as a threat.
A threat.
Right. Either the proverbial finger wagging from those at the top of a hierarchy to those at the bottom. It's a strict command to accept your limitations and not challenge the status quo.
But, and this is where our journey begins, if we contrast this modern, somewhat oppressive know your place with the ancient Greek ideal that birthed the phrase, the difference is completely staggering.
It's night and day.
For the ancients, knowing oneself wasn't about accepting your boundaries at all. It was the exact opposite.
It was about discovering your unlimited potential.
Yes. It was about mastering the art of living, pushing past your mortal constraints, and navigating the incredibly chaotic waters of life as the absolute captain of your own ship.
Which is such a powerful image.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because going from discover your unlimited potential as the captain of your soul to shut up and stay in your lane is a massive, tragic, historical downgrade.
It really is.
How in the world did we get from point A to point B? To understand that, we need to introduce the central figure of our deep dive today, the man who provides the blueprint for our entire discussion.
Michel Foucault.
Foucault.
Foucault is absolutely essential here. And to understand his ideas, you first have to understand the man. In the interviews provided in our sources, Foucault actively, almost aggressively, resists being put into any kind of neat intellectual box. Throughout his career, critics and academics constantly tried to label him.
They always want to put a label on you.
Always. They called him a Marxist, a structuralist, a linguist, a traditional historian, and he rejected every single one of those labels.
Every single one.
For Foucault, the very goal of life and the specific goal of his massive body of written work was to become someone you weren't at the start.
That's a great way to put it.
He has this wonderful quote where he essentially says that If you know exactly what you're going to say at the end of a book before you even start writing it, you wouldn't have the courage to write it at all.
For him, the game of life and intellect is only worth playing if you genuinely do not know the outcome.
Exactly.
I just love that perspective. It makes learning an actual adventure rather than just a chore. And his perspective wasn't just born out of thin air. It was deeply shaped by his own lived experiences.
Yes, his background is so important here.
The sources detail how, back in the 1950s, Foucault worked in a psychiatric hospital in France. He famously joked that he was mad enough to study madness, but sane enough to actually research it.
It was like a great line.
And you have to picture the 1950s in psychiatry. This was the absolute dawn of neurosurgery, of lobotomies, and the very beginning of psychopharmacology. It was a wild, highly experimental time.
A very dark time in many ways.
Yeah. And Foucault had the freedom to just wander the wards, talk to the patients, observe the doctors, and take in the entire ecosystem.
And after a few months of this, he started profoundly questioning the absolute necessity of the things he was seeing.
Right.
That environment was the crucible for his entire philosophy. He looked at the marginalized, the madmen, the outcasts, and historically, the lepers and criminals.
The people society pushes away.
Exactly. And he realized that the way society treats these people on the margins reveals the completely arbitrary nature of our central institutions.
We look at a psychiatric ward or a prison and we think, well, this is just how it has to be. This is science. This is objective truth.
But Foucault realized, no, it is not.
It's just the current system we've agreed upon. Foucault wasn't trying to write some utopian, perfect program for the future, right?
Not at all. He actively avoided utopianism.
Because utopian ideas usually go wrong.
Exactly. He noted that even the absolute best-intentioned programs throughout history, like the grand ideals of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which we will discuss later, being used to justify the horrors of the French Revolution, they almost always mutate into new tools of oppression.
So his goal was different.
Foucault's mission was much more grounded and, frankly, much more liberating. He wanted to show people that they are far freer than they currently feel.
Freer than they feel.
Yes. He wanted to prove, through exhaustive historical research, that the things we accept today as universal, eternal, unchanging truths about human nature are actually just historical constructs.
They were invented at a specific time.
By specific people, for a specific reason. And the beautiful logical conclusion to that is, if something was invented, it can be dismantled.
Which brings us to a really fascinating and perhaps controversial point from the text regarding the concept of humanism.
This is a big one.
Now, we need to pause here and make something absolutely crystal clear to you listening. We are not taking a side on this, nor are we endorsing this specific viewpoint. We are strictly and impartially imparting what Michel Foucault argues in the source material.
Exactly. We are just the messengers of his philosophical argument here.
Right. So Foucault claimed that humanism, the idea that there is a core, universal, shared human essence that we must respect and protect, is not some unquestionable, objective good.
He was very skeptical of it.
He observed that throughout modern history, the concept of humanism has been used dogmatically across the entire political spectrum to justify almost anything.
Yes, the sources list Foucault pointing out that Marxists use humanism, liberals use humanism, the right, the center, the left.
Even the Nazis and the Catholic Church used their own definitions of humanism to justify their specific morality, their rules, or their atrocities.
His core argument there is that tying ourselves to one rigid, supposedly scientific definition of what a human is might actually be a trap.
A trap.
By defining the human too narrowly, we might inadvertently limit future freedoms and ways of existing that we can't even imagine yet.
Again, a highly provocative thought, but central to understanding why Foucault wants to tear down our assumptions.
Definitely.
So, if there is no eternal human essence, what are we? Foucault's answer is that we are the product of invisible forces and practices. We are constantly being shaped.
And to categorize exactly how this shaping happens across history, Foucault breaks down practical human reason into 4 distinct categories.
Which he calls technologies.
It's a brilliant framework. Let's walk through them because we need to understand the first 3 to truly appreciate the 4th.
Okay, let's do it.
First, Foucault identifies technologies of production. These are exactly what they sound like. They are the tools, the machines, the agricultural methods, the factories, everything that allows us to manipulate the physical world, produce things, and transform nature.
Right, so everything from a prehistoric stone axe to an AI-driven car assembly line, it's how we shape stuff. Got it. What's the second?
The second are technologies of science systems. This refers to language, symbols, mathematics, and meaning. It is how we communicate, how we write down laws, how we express abstract concepts.
It allows us to use signs to convey ideas to one another.
Yes.
Okay, words, numbers, emojis, makes perfect sense. We use these every second of the day. And the third.
The third is where Foucault spent the vast majority of his career: technologies of power.
Power.
These are the systems, the institutions, and the practices that determine how individuals are governed, how they are dominated, how they are objectified, and how they are forced to submit to a certain status or authority.
So we're talking about structures.
Exactly. This includes prisons, schools, the military, hospitals, and governments. It's how society shapes the individual from the outside in.
But the sources point out that late in his life, Foucault realized his work was incomplete. He had spent decades looking at how power crushes or shapes people from the outside technologies of power.
Right.
But he realized you absolutely cannot understand power without understanding how individuals actively participate in policing themselves.
You can't just have a guard in a watchtower. The prisoner has to learn to watch himself.
That is such a chilling thought. And that realization birthed the fourth category, which is the entire core of our deep dive today.
Yes, the fourth category, technologies of the self.
Technologies of the self.
These are the specific methods, the daily practices, the internal operations that individuals intentionally perform on their own bodies, their own souls, their own thoughts, and their own behavior.
And they do this to transform themselves, to modify themselves in order to achieve a certain state.
Whether that state is happiness, purity, wisdom, perfection, or even immortality.
I want you listening to really internalize this concept because it applies to you right now. Think about your own life today. Think about all the things you do to try to improve yourself or manage yourself.
It's everywhere.
If you wear an Apple Watch or an Oura Ring to track your sleep and your heart rate, that is a technology of the self. If you go to therapy every Thursday to analyze your childhood, that is a technology of the self.
Absolutely.
If you keep a daily gratitude journal, if you practice mindfulness meditation, if you force yourself to go to the gym at 5 a.m., these are all modern technologies of the self.
Foucault's massive insight is that these practices aren't just neutral hobbies. They are profound tools that literally construct who you are.
They build the self.
What's absolutely fascinating here is how these technologies of the self have evolved and mutated over the centuries. Foucault believed that to understand who we are today, we have to trace the history of these practices.
So let's travel back to the ancient Greeks.
Let's do it.
We mentioned the phrase know yourself earlier. We all know the famous phrase carved into the stone at the Oracle of Delphi in ancient Greece, know yourself, or in the original Greek, gnothe sautou.
Very famous.
In Western culture, we have elevated this phrase to the absolute pinnacle of philosophical achievement. We treat it like the ultimate goal of human existence. But our sources reveal that we actually have a massive historical blind spot here.
We do. For the ancient Greeks, know yourself was not the overarching goal of life.
It wasn't.
No, it was originally just a secondary, almost technical rule. It was a subset of a much older, much more important and overarching principle. Care for yourself, or in Greek, epimelesthai sautou.
Care for yourself. That was the prime directive. Know yourself was basically just practical advice for when you went to consult the oracle.
Exactly. Think about why people went to the Oracle of Delphi.
Yeah.
They went because their city was facing a famine, or they're about to go to war, or they had a massive political crisis.
High stakes?
Very high stakes. They were highly stressed. The carving, know yourself, was essentially a warning at the door.
Like a sign.
It meant, remember, you are mortal. Do not think you are a god. Do not ask the gods questions that are beyond your mortal station.
Or, more practically, it simply meant search your own mind and know exactly what you actually want to ask before you step up to the mic and bother the oracle.
That completely changes the context.
It's less discover your deep inner truth and more check your ego at the door.
Yes. And the sources show that it was only much later in history that Western philosophy became completely obsessed with know yourself and totally forgot the original, far more demanding context of epimelesthai sautou, taking active, rigorous daily care of one's own soul.
To see exactly how care for yourself operated in antiquity, the sources take us deep into one of Plato's most important dialogues, Alcibiades I.
A truly foundational text.
And we should note, this specific text was considered so foundational in the ancient world that centuries later, Neoplatonist philosophers used it as the absolute required starting point for any young man wanting to study philosophy or enter politics.
It was the ancient equivalent of a prerequisite 101 course.
Let's set the scene for this dialogue because the characters are amazing. You have Socrates, the older, wise, somewhat annoying philosopher who questions everything.
The classic gadfly.
And then you have Alcibiades. Alcibiades is this incredibly young, obscenely wealthy, massively privileged guy. He comes from the best family. He is devastatingly handsome.
Golden boy of Athens.
Exactly. He is just transitioning into adulthood. The text specifically notes his beard is just starting to grow in, which means his older male suitors and mentors are starting to abandon him. He is stepping out on his own.
And he is hungry for power.
He doesn't just want to be rich. He wants to stand in front of the Athenian assembly and rule. He wants to conquer. He wants to rule Athens and potentially Sparta and eventually the whole Persian world.
He is the ultimate arrogant rich kid with massive ambitions, but right at this critical turning point in his life, Socrates steps in and essentially blocks his path.
Socrates confronts him and completely dismantles his ego.
Socrates points out that Alcibiades wants to stand in front of the city and advise them on matters of war, peace, and justice. But Socrates points out, Alcibiades actually knows absolutely nothing about justice.
Socrates really goes for the throat here. He compares Alcibiades to the kings of Sparta and Persia.
Okay.
He says, look at the Spartan kings. They undergo rigorous, brutal training from birth. Look at the Persian princes. They are taught by the 4 wisest men in the empire. One teaches them religion, one teaches them truth, one teaches them justice, and one teaches them courage.
And then Socrates looks at Alcibiades and says, who educated you? An old, worn-out slave. You have the education of a peasant, and you think you can rule the world.
Brutal.
It's a brutal takedown, but it serves a vital philosophical purpose.
Yeah.
Alcibiades is ambitious, but he is totally unequipped. He lacks the techne, which is the Greek word for technique, art, or mastery, required to govern anything.
Socrates tells him that before he can even think about caring for the city of Athens, he must first learn to care for himself.
But this prompts a really profound philosophical puzzle. If the prime directive is care for yourself, you first have to define what this self actually is.
Right. If you don't know what the self is, you might accidentally spend your entire life caring for things that merely belong to the self, rather than caring for the self itself.
You might waste your life polishing the car instead of fixing the engine.
I love that analogy.
Exactly. And to solve this puzzle, Socrates walks Alcibiades through a brilliant, highly logical analogy about a shoemaker. It's a classic Socratic dialogue where he corners his opponent with simple questions.
Let's walk through it exactly as the text lays it out, because the logic is airtight.
Okay, so Socrates asks Alcibiades, a shoemaker uses a knife and a needle and other tools to cut leather, right?
Okay, let's work through this together. Yes, a shoemaker uses a knife.
And Socrates asks, is the person using the tool fundamentally different from the tool being used?
I mean, logically, yes. If I'm holding a knife, I am obviously not the knife. If I am typing on my smartphone, I am not the smartphone. The user and the instrument are separate entities. I follow that.
Perfect. So Socrates takes it one step closer to the human body. He says, okay, the shoemaker uses his hands to hold the knife and his eyes to see the leather. Does the shoemaker use his hands and his eyes?
Oh, okay. Yes, he uses his hands and eyes to do the work.
Therefore, following our established logic, if the user is fundamentally different from the tool being used, and the human being uses their hands, their eyes, and their entire body, what does that mean?
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
It means the human being, the user, must be fundamentally different from the body itself. The body is just another tool, like the knife or the smartphone.
Exactly.
So what is the human being then? If I'm not my body, and I'm not some weird amalgamation of my body and something else, what's left?
Socrates' conclusion is inescapable. Man is the soul.
The soul.
The soul is the entity giving the orders. The soul is the user of the bodily tools. The soul is the master.
That is incredibly elegant. So if man is the soul, then to care for yourself is specifically to care for your soul.
Yes.
Socrates is telling Alcibiades that taking care of his physical body, going to the ancient gym, looking handsome, is just taking care of a possession. Amassing wealth and political connections is taking care of an even more distant, external possession.
But caring for the soul requires actually knowing the soul. Which brings us right back to the oracle's maxim, know yourself.
Precisely. Know yourself is the necessary technique required to achieve the goal of care for yourself. But how does a soul actually know itself? How does an invisible thing look at itself?
Yeah. Plato introduces a beautiful poetic concept here called the divine mirror.
Let's talk about the divine mirror because the text uses the analogy of an eye.
Yes. Think about an eye. An eye can see everything in the world, but it cannot see itself directly. The only way an eye can see itself is by looking into a mirror, or more specifically in Plato's analogy, by looking into the pupil of another eye. By looking into the very part of the other eye that actually possesses the virtue of sight, it sees its own reflection.
Okay, I'm tracking.
Plato argues that the soul operates the exact same way. A soul can only truly know itself by looking into another soul, and specifically, it must look into the divine part of the other soul, the region where intellect, reason, and wisdom reside.
So, practically speaking, Alcibiades cannot discover who he is by sitting alone in a dark room and meditating.
No, he cannot.
He has to engage in deep, challenging dialogue with a wiser soul, like Socrates. By looking into the divine mirror of Socrates' intellect, Alcibiades will see a reflection of his own divine potential.
And he will recognize the eternal rules of right conduct, justice, and virtue.
That is the ultimate takeaway of this ancient Greek model. Socrates is telling Alcibiades, and, by extension, you, the listener, true virtue and rigorous, deeply examined self-care are the absolute prerequisites to leadership.
You simply cannot give a city where you do not possess yourself.
If you try to rule in a state of ignorance, driven by your own unexamined ego and dark desires, you will only bring ruin and destruction to yourself and to the citizens you claim to lead.
The sources sum this up perfectly. Happiness for a city doesn't come from building massive stone walls or launching fleets of invincible warships.
True happiness for a city comes from the virtue of its leaders and its citizens, period.
So, to summarize this early Greek framework, taking care of oneself is a highly active, highly political, and deeply relational phase of life. It's a temporary boot camp for ambitious young men preparing to enter the public sphere.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture of history, as we move forward a few hundred years into the Hellenistic and early Roman imperial periods, this entire concept undergoes a radical foundational shift.
Right, the world changes, and so does the self.
We are talking about the era of the vast Roman Empire. The city-states of Greece are gone, swallowed up by massive, sprawling empires.
And because the political world is so huge and out of the individual's control, the concept of care for yourself changes.
It goes from being a temporary boot camp for a few privileged young politicians to becoming a lifelong, universal, medicalized practice for literally everyone.
That is the key shift. It becomes medicalized.
Medicalized.
It stops being just a stepping stone to ruling others and becomes the ultimate goal in and of itself. Philosophy shifts its focus. You are now expected to withdraw from the corrupt, chaotic world of politics and focus entirely on your internal state.
You are expected to become your own spiritual doctor. You must continuously monitor your spiritual health, your daily actions, and your mental state from the time you are a youth all the way to your deathbed.
This is the golden era of philosophies like Stoicism, Epicureanism, and Cynicism.
And the toolkit for caring for the self, the technologies of the self, expands dramatically during this time.
The focus shifts away from the Socratic dialogue, where a master like Socrates actively interrogates you, to a culture of intense listening and, crucially, a culture of writing.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The sheer volume of writing that the elites of this era did about their own mundane daily lives is absolutely mind-blowing.
Writing became a central, indispensable technology of the self.
They constantly took notes. They wrote endless letters to their friends and mentors. They kept detailed journals, not just to record history, but to solidify the philosophical truths they were trying to learn.
They were writing to literally shape their own souls.
And the sources give us this incredibly specific, highly amusing window into this world through a letter. It's a letter written by the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius to his friend and former teacher, Fronto.
Written around the year 144 or 145 AD.
Now, you would expect the emperor of the known world to be writing about troop movements or tax policies or assassinations, but what is he actually writing about?
Oh, this letter's an absolute treasure. I love this document because it's so remarkably mundane yet philosophically vital.
Right.
Marcus Aurelius isn't writing about grand statecraft at all. He's exhaustively detailing his minute daily physical and mental regiments.
He writes to Fronto and tells him, hey, I woke up with a slight cold today, so I decided to stay in bed a little longer.
He then specifically mentions that he gargled with honey water to soothe his sore throat. But he doesn't just say he gargled.
He insists on explicitly explaining the mechanics of it, that he swallowed the honey water all the way to the back of his throat, held it there, and then spat it out.
I just love the mental image of the most powerful man on the planet, agonizing over the exact technique of his honey water gargle.
And he goes on, he talks about his incredibly modest diet. He tells Fronto he ate just a tiny plain piece of bread, and he sat there eating his tiny bread while watching everyone else in the palace gorge themselves on this massive feast of beans, onions, and herring stuffed with caviar.
He is deliberately contrasting his restraint with their excess.
He then describes his afternoon. He says he went down to the olive press room and worked up a sweat doing physical labor. He chats with his mother, he gives her a kiss, and then at the end of the day, he retires to his room in silence to evaluate his actions before going to sleep.
It sounds exactly like a modern influencer's day-in-the-life morning routine vlog.
Oh my gosh, yes. Hey guys, just doing my honey water gargle, eating my plain toast, grinding at the olive press. Love you, Mom. Time to journal.
But while it sounds trivial, Foucault argues that this intense focus on the minutiae of daily life, exactly what he ate, exactly how his throat felt, his specific interactions with his mother, this is the care of the self in action.
The body and the soul are deeply, inextricably intertwined in the Hellenistic worldview.
He is meticulously documenting his physical reality to ensure that his spiritual reality is living in accordance with his Stoic principles.
Exactly. The writing is the tool of self-creation. And this leads us directly into the specific Stoic techniques, which the Greeks called ascesis.
Now, we need to clarify this term. Today, when we hear the word asceticism, we immediately picture medieval monks starving themselves in caves, wearing rags, and punishing their bodies to reject the physical world.
But Stoic ascesis was absolutely not about renouncing the world.
No, it was about mastering the world. It was a training program.
It was about equipping yourself with the mental armor needed to handle whatever chaotic things the world threw at you. It was about gaining absolute independence from external circumstances. You can't control if the ship sinks, but you can control how you react as the ship goes down.
And they had specific exercises to build this armor. The Roman philosopher Seneca gives us a perfect example with his practice of nightly self-examination.
Every single evening.
Every single evening, before going to sleep, Seneca would mentally review his entire day. But, and this distinction is crucial for what we will discuss later, it was not a trial where he was a guilty sinner begging a judge for forgiveness.
Right, there is no guilt here. The sources describe Seneca acting much more like a building inspector or an administrative accountant.
Imagine a modern software developer reviewing their code at the end of the day.
Seneca is looking over the ledger of his daily actions. He is checking to see if his actions aligned with his established rules of conduct.
If he made a mistake, it wasn't a moral sin that stained his soul. It was just a strategic error.
Yes. If he lost his temper, he wouldn't say, "Oh, I am a wicked, terrible person." He would say, "I shouldn't have argued with that fool in the forum. It was a waste of energy and a breach of my principles."
He is simply adjusting his strategy for the next day. He is an administrator bringing his actions into alignment with his rules. It's entirely practical.
Alongside this daily review, the Stoics practiced something called melet, or meditation. But again, throw away your modern preconceptions.
This wasn't sitting cross-legged, clearing your mind, and focusing on your breath to ambient music.
Stoic meditation was a highly active, intensely imaginative, and sometimes brutal mental exercise. The most famous of these is the premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils.
This is such a powerful psychological tool. In the premeditatio malorum, you don't just idly worry about the future. Worrying is useless.
Instead, you vividly, viscerally imagine that the absolute worst-case scenario has already happened to you.
Let's apply this to a modern listener. Say you were terrified of getting fired from your job. A Stoic wouldn't say, "Oh, don't worry, it probably won't happen. Just think positive."
A Stoic would say, "Close your eyes. Imagine you were fired this morning. Imagine packing your desk into a cardboard box. Imagine the humiliating walk to your car. Imagine checking your bank account and seeing it dwindle. Imagine the awkward conversations with your family."
You force your mind to fully accept that this hypothetical reality is happening right now.
And why do you do this? Because by facing the absolute worst, you strip the fear of its paralyzing power. You realize that even in the worst-case scenario, you are still breathing. Your core self, your ability to reason, remains intact. You will survive.
It is an inoculation against anxiety. And they didn't just stop at mental exercises. They practiced gymnasia, which were real physical training exercises in deprivation.
You don't just think about being tough, you test it in the real world.
The text mentions a wild practice that completely illustrates this.
Imagine you are a wealthy Roman. You order your cooks to prepare a massive, incredibly delicious feast. We are talking roasted meats, exotic fruits, the finest wines.
You sit down at the table.
You let your mouth water. You let the physical desire build to an absolute peak, and then you don't eat a single bite of it.
You call over your servants. You give the entire glorious feast to them, and you sit there and eat their plain, basic, coarse peasant food instead.
It is the ultimate flex of independence. You are proving to your own mind, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that you are not a slave to your own bodily desires. You are the master of your vessel.
To manage this constant internal vigilance, the philosopher Epictetus provided two brilliant, enduring analogies for how your mind should operate minute to minute.
First, he said you must act as a night watchman for your own mind.
Imagine a guard standing at the heavily fortified gate of a city at midnight.
When a thought approaches the gate of your consciousness, the watchman demands identification. You do not just let unauthorized, destructive, or anxious thoughts wander into your city. You stop them at the gate.
And the second analogy is even more specific, the money changer.
In the ancient world, currency wasn't standardized. A money changer had to carefully examine every single coin they received to ensure it wasn't a counterfeit.
They would weigh it in their hands, they would test the metal, they would inspect the emperor's stamp on the face. Epictetus says you must do exactly this with your own mental representations.
When an impression enters your mind, say, the thought, that guy just insulted me, I need to punch him, you must test that thought like a coin.
You test its weight and its authenticity against the strict rules of Stoic reason.
Is this thought true? Is it useful? Or is it a counterfeit impression, forged by my own ego, trying to trick me into giving up my tranquility for a moment of anger? If it's counterfeit, you throw it out.
So, to synthesize this entire era, the Stoic toolkit, the meticulous written diaries, the emotionless daily ledger review, the vivid meditations on disaster, the physical tests of endurance, the constant policing of mental impressions like a night watchman, it was all designed to build an impenetrable, self-sufficient fortress of the self.
The goal was to fully inhabit this world with total mastery, independence, and tranquility.
But history never stands still.
As we move out of the classical and Roman eras and head headlong into the Christian era, we witness what Foucault considers a massive, fundamental, almost violent rupture in the history of the self.
Everything we just talked about gets flipped on its head.
Foucault calls it the Great Reversal. The fundamental goal of human existence entirely flips.
You go from the Stoic ideal of equipping the self to master this world to the Christian ideal of renouncing the self to prepare for the next world.
To save your immortal soul in the afterlife, you must fundamentally destroy your earthly identity in this life.
And the way early Christians achieved this destruction of the ego was through radical, unprecedented new technologies of the self.
The first of these was a public practice called exemesis.
Exemesis.
Let's break this down, because when a modern person hears the word penance or confession, they immediately picture the modern Catholic system.
You go into a dark, quiet wooden booth. You whisper your sins to a priest through a screen. He gives you a few prayers to say, and you walk out feeling cleansed.
Exemesis in early Christianity looked absolutely nothing like that. It was raw, it was physical, and it was entirely public.
It was essentially a highly theatrical status.
In the first few centuries of the church, if you committed a grave sin like adultery or murder or denying your faith during a Roman persecution, you couldn't just say a private prayer. You had to formally petition the local bishop to enter the order of penitence.
And this wasn't a weekend retreat. This was a grueling status that could last anywhere from 4 to 10 years, and sometimes for the rest of your life.
The sources paint a terrifyingly vivid picture of this using the writings of the early Christian theologian Tertullian. I want you to imagine the scene happening in your local church today.
The penitent is ordered to wear a rough, agonizing hair shirt that scrapes their skin raw. They are covered in ashes. They look starved, filthy, and broken.
On Sunday, they are dragged to the front of the entire congregation. They are weeping uncontrollably. They throw themselves face down in the dirt, and they literally crawl around, grabbing the knees and kissing the feet of their fellow Christians, begging through tears for the community to pray for them.
It was pure, unadulterated drama.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to ask, why the drama? Why was this intense physical humiliation required?
The function of this extreme theatricality wasn't primarily to explain the specific granular details of the sin. The community probably already knew what they did.
The purpose was to physically demonstrate the ultimate ontological status of the sinner.
It was a visual representation of their broken soul.
Exactly. And the public display of humiliation and suffering was modeled directly on the concept of martyrdom.
Just as a physical martyr willingly gives up their biological body for God in the Colosseum, the penitent must willingly destroy their social identity, their reputation, and their ego for God.
The underlying formula of exemesis is summarized by the Latin phrase ego non sum, ego, I am not I, or I am no longer who I was.
You are showing the community, through visceral, physical action, that you are violently severing all ties with your past self.
The revelation of the self is simultaneously the destruction of the self.
It is incredibly intense.
But over the centuries, as the church grew and Christianity moved out of the era of Roman persecution and into the era of the Desert Fathers and early monasticism, a new technology of the self emerged.
It shifted from the physical to the verbal.
This new practice was called exagoresis, and this one was all about endless, continuous verbal confession.
Exagoresis takes root in the 4th century monasteries. And to understand it, you have to understand the foundational rule of monastic life: absolute, unwavering, unquestioning obedience to a master or an abbot.
The text points out a monastic rule that sounds absolutely chilling to modern ears. If a monk did anything without the explicit permission of their master, even if it was a good deed, or even if they were just doing something as simple as taking a breath differently, it was officially considered theft.
Theft, because you don't even own your own body or your own will. Everything belongs to God, managed by the master. You own nothing.
Exactly. In this environment of total crushing obedience, an influential monk named John Cassian adapted those old Stoic analogies we talked about earlier, the watchman and the money changer.
But he gave them a deeply paranoid, hyper-internal, spiritual twist.
Remember how the Stoic money changer was just looking for logical truth, checking if an impression was rational?
Yes, checking for fake coins of irrational emotion.
Cassian uses the same analogy, but for Cassian's Christian money changer, the stakes are cosmic. He is not looking for logical fallacies, he is looking for literal demons.
When a thought pops into a monk's head, the monk must inspect the coin of that thought to see if it bears the authentic face of God, or if it is secretly a counterfeit coin forged in hell by the demon of lust or the demon of pride.
And Cassian believed that these demons were incredibly tricky, right? They wouldn't just pop into your head and say, hey, go commit a murder. They would hide dark, sinful impulses beneath seemingly innocent or even holy thoughts.
A monk might think, I should fast for 3 extra days to be closer to God. That sounds holy.
But Cassian would say, wait, examine that coin. Is that thought actually from God, or is it the demon of pride trying to make you feel spiritually superior to your brother monks?
That is the exact trap. And because the human mind is so fallen, so deeply flawed and easily tricked, Cassian argued that the individual monk simply cannot trust his own judgment.
You cannot be your own money changer.
The only way to definitively defeat the demon and expose the counterfeit coin is to vocalize the thought to your master. This is the absolute crux of exagoresis.
The act of speaking the thought out loud, dragging it out of the dark corners of your mind, and exposing it to the light of the master's authority is the specific mechanism that drives the demon away.
The text gives this incredible anecdote about a young monk who stole some bread. He ate it, and he felt immensely guilty, but he was too ashamed to admit it to his master.
He kept the secret hidden inside his mind. And because it was kept in the darkness of his own solitary self, the evil thought maintained its absolute power over him. It tormented him.
It wasn't until he finally broke down, threw himself on the ground in front of the older monks, and confessed the theft out loud that the demonic hold broke.
In this monastic system, silence itself becomes a grave sin. You are not allowed to have a private inner life.
You must constantly, relentlessly narrate every single flicker of thought, every tiny passing impulse, every dream to your master.
Self-renunciation becomes permanently and inextricably tied to the act of confessing your inner truth. You give up yourself by speaking yourself.
Let's stop and think about how massive of a shift this is.
The idea that you possess a deep, hidden, potentially dangerous inner truth, and that the only way to be saved, cured, or liberated is to constantly articulate that truth out loud to an authority figure.
That exact framework lays the psychological groundwork for the entire modern Western world.
It is the blueprint for how we view therapy, self-help, and even oversharing on social media today. If you don't post it, if you don't speak it, it eats you alive.
It is the birth of the confessing animal.
But to see how this deeply religious, monastic confession transforms into the secular, modern individual that we recognize today, we have to leap forward in history to the 18th century.
We have to look at the Enlightenment, and specifically the man who essentially invented the modern self as we currently experience it, Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Yes, Rousseau. We are bringing in Huck Gutman's essay from our sources here, which brilliantly frames Rousseau as the very first romantic.
To understand Rousseau, you have to understand what he was reacting against. The 18th century was the age of reason. Thinkers were obsessed with logic, science, categorization, and rationality.
And then Rousseau kicks the door down, and his entire life project is encapsulated in one of his most famous quotes, "I felt before I thought."
With that one sentence, "I felt before I thought," Rousseau completely overthrows the rationalist paradigm. He declares that intense emotion, not cold logic, is the absolute, irrefutable core of human identity. You are your feelings.
Gutman makes this amazing historical comparison in the text between Rousseau and St. Augustine. St. Augustine wrote his famous book called Confessions way back in the 4th century.
But Augustine's goal was strictly theological. He confessed all his youthful sins, like stealing pears from an orchard or his lustful younger days, purely to demonstrate how incredibly magnanimous God's grace was to save a wretch like him.
In Augustine's book, his own self is basically just a prop to show how great God is.
Exactly. But when Rousseau writes his own massive book, also titled Confessions over a Millennium Later, his goal is completely secular and entirely self-centered.
Rousseau isn't confessing to God. He is confessing to the public. He is writing to justify his own uniquely flawed, highly paranoid, incredibly individualized self to a society that he genuinely believes is inherently hostile, corrupt, and out to get him.
And Rousseau goes all in. He promises his readers, right in the introduction, that he will reveal absolutely everything. He promises unprecedented transparency.
He details every shameful desire, every embarrassing social mistake, his sexual quirks, his petty thefts, his betrayals of friends. He wants to make his soul completely transparent on the page.
He thinks this absolute confession will liberate him. But here is the massive, tragic irony of what Rousseau actually accomplishes.
This is the crux of Gutman's analysis. To define this completely unique, unprecedented self, Rousseau has to conceptually draw a hard line between his I and everything that is not I.
He has to radically separate himself from nature, from society, from his peers, from everyone around him. He says, "I am different from everyone I have ever seen."
That act of extreme division is the first necessary step to creating a modern subject. You have to put up walls to define a house.
But as Gutman points out, once Rousseau successfully separates himself from the rest of the world, he is consumed by intense paranoia and profound, crushing isolation.
He realizes he is entirely alone inside his own head. Imagine walking into a crowded party and suddenly realizing that every single person there is fundamentally different from you, that they can never truly understand you, and that you are entirely, terrifyingly alone.
That is what Rousseau did to himself on purpose.
And to cope with this unbearable loneliness, Rousseau does something fascinating. He deploys his imagination.
Since the real world is too hostile and too alienating, he retreats into a detailed fantasy world of his own making.
The sources give this wild, almost unbelievable example of how powerful Rousseau's imagination was and how it bled into his reality.
He writes a wildly successful novel where he creates a fictional, idealized, perfect woman named Julie.
And his imagination is so potent, his internal world is so strong, that when he eventually meets a real-life woman named Madame Duteau, he literally projects his fictional character, Julie, right on top of her.
Reality is entirely subsumed by his fantasy. He writes in his Confessions that he looked at the real Madame Duteau and he saw Julie. And then eventually he only saw Julie.
The boundary between the real external world and his imagined internal self completely collapses under the weight of his isolated ego.
It is the ultimate triumph of the internal over the external.
It's like a modern person falling so deeply into a parasocial relationship with an internet personality or an AI companion that they lose touch with real human connection.
The grand, tragic irony of Rousseau's entire life culminates in an experience he describes at St. Peter's Island on Lake Bienne in Switzerland.
Rousseau, the architect of the hyper-individualized, distinct, loud, confessing modern self, finds his moment of absolute supreme happiness only when he completely destroys that very self.
It's beautifully described in the text, and it's a profound psychological moment. He is living in exile. He goes down to the shores of the lake, completely alone.
He sits by the water and just listens to the rhythmic ebb and flow of the waves. And as he stares at the water, He enters a state of total idleness.
He stops thinking. He stops analyzing his paranoia. He stops confessing. He stops being Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the persecuted genius.
He completely dissolves his hard boundaries into the rhythm of nature. It's an experience of total, undifferentiated unity. It is exactly what Sigmund Freud would later coin as the oceanic feeling.
The man who spent his life building the modern ego found true peace only by annihilating it.
But Michel Foucault's analysis of Rousseau's legacy adds a really chilling structural layer to this story. Rousseau thought he was writing his confessions to liberate himself, to prove his unique innocence, and to celebrate human freedom.
But Foucault argues that Rousseau accidentally built a trap.
A massive trap.
By insisting that we must endlessly catalog every feeling, every unique desire, every hidden trait, and every childhood trauma, Rousseau inadvertently created the exact type of highly visible, easily categorized individual that modern disciplinary power absolutely loves to control.
By putting his entire self on the record, by demanding that we constantly analyze our uniqueness, Rousseau made himself, and all of us who follow his model, the perfect subjects for institutional surveillance.
So what does this all mean?
Let's take stock. We have the Stoic administrator checking his daily ledger for logical errors. We have the Christian monk hunting for demons in his thoughts and confessing them to his master. And we have Rousseau writing a massive paranoid encyclopedia of his own unique feelings.
This historical collision brings us perfectly to the final epic battle of ideas in our deep dive, detailed in Patrick H. Hutton's essay.
It is a heavyweight intellectual bout. Sigmund Freud versus Michel Foucault. The question is, who actually invented the modern psyche?
It's a brilliant juxtaposition. Let's lay out Freud's view first, because it is the water we all swim in today.
For Freud, the psyche, the mind, the self, is a very real, hidden, almost biological object. It exists inside you, functioning largely in the dark realm of the unconscious.
Freud argues that who we are today is largely trapped by the forgotten, repressed traumas of our childhood. Our true motivations, our fears, our desires, are hidden from us by complex psychological defense mechanisms.
Freud looks at the human mind and says, there is a dark, locked basement down there, and it is full of real, terrifying monsters from your past. And psychoanalysis is the key to the basement.
Psychoanalysis, in Freud's view, is an archaeology of memory. The therapist is the archaeologist.
They dig through the layers of dirt, your dreams, your slips of the tongue, your free associations, to unearth these hidden traumas.
By digging them up and bringing them into the light of consciousness, Freud believed the ego could regain its power over the unconscious, and the patient could be cured.
Freud views psychoanalysis as a hard science discovering pre-existing truths. But Foucault looks at Freud's flashlight, he looks at the basement, and he says, you didn't find those monsters down there. You built the basement, and you put the monsters in it.
Foucault offers a radical, complete takedown of the entire Freudian model. Foucault argues that the psyche, as Freud describes it, does not actually exist as a hidden biological reality. It is a historical abstraction.
Wait, I need to push back here, or at least play devil's advocate. Freudian concepts and the therapy derived from them have legitimately helped millions of people process real trauma. Is Foucault really saying that all of that inner work, all of that therapeutic progress is just a manufactured illusion?
Right.
Isn't that a bit cynical?
It sounds cynical, but Foucault isn't saying people don't suffer or heal. He is questioning the framework we use to explain that suffering. This raises an important question. Where did this abstraction of the psyche come from, if not biology?
Foucault argues it was created by the disciplinary and policing forces of the 18th and 19th centuries.
Remember the technologies of power. The asylums, the prisons, the clinics, the schools. As society grew more complex, these institutions needed a highly efficient way to categorize, isolate, and control massive populations of human behavior.
They needed spreadsheets for human souls.
Exactly. They needed to know definitively what was normal and what was mad, what was legal and what was criminal, what was healthy and what was perverse.
To do this, they forced individuals to constantly confess their innermost thoughts to authorities. Doctors, psychiatrists, wardens, teachers.
Foucault argues that the psyche is just the shadow cast by these massive institutional structures onto the individual. You are taught to look inside yourself and find a psyche because the clinic requires you to have one in order to treat you.
So did Freud actually invent anything new? According to Foucault, absolutely not.
Freud was not a brave pioneer discovering a brand new, uncharted continent of the mind. He was just the latest, highly successful synthesizer of ancient techniques.
Foucault points out that Freud merely took the exact same tools used by the ancients, the Stoic money changer techniques of testing mental representations, and the Christian monastic requirement of endless, exhaustive verbal confession to a master, and he simply stripped them of their religious vocabulary.
That is the brilliant sleight of hand. Freud took off the monk's rough robe, he put on a crisp white doctor's coat, and he dressed these ancient, spiritually coercive rituals up in sterile, medical, scientific terminology.
The priest became the psychoanalyst, the confessional booth became the therapist's couch, the demon became the repressed trauma.
But the dynamic of power, the necessity of speaking your secret truth to an authority figure who interprets it for you, remained exactly the same.
The contrast in their underlying methodologies is profound. Freud uses an archaeological approach. He digs deep into the past, specifically your childhood, to find the hidden, original, singular cause of your current behavior.
He believes there is a singular objective truth waiting to be found in the dirt.
Foucault, on the other hand, uses what he calls genealogy. He looks from the present moment backward, not to find a hidden truth, but to map out how humans have constantly invented random, chaotic forms, vocabularies, and power structures that end up trapping us.
For Foucault, there is no pristine, true self, hidden in the past, waiting to be liberated. There is only the long, complex history of how we have been forced and how we have forced ourselves to talk about ourselves.
Let's bring this all the way home. I want you, the listener, to really think about what this means for your life today.
Think about how you examine your own life right now.
Every single time you sit down to analyze your thoughts, every time you talk to a therapist about your anxiety, every time you write in a gratitude journal or try to optimize your morning routine, you are not just innocently looking inside yourself.
You are actively participating in a 2,000-year-old game of power, knowledge, and self-creation.
You are utilizing a toolkit built by ghosts. You are using the tools of Stoic administrators, Christian monks, and 18th century romantics.
The self isn't a static biological organ nestled next to your heart. It is a massive, shifting historical patchwork.
It is an accumulation of techniques. It is the Greek focus on active self-care as a path to political virtue, layered tightly over the Roman administrative review of daily actions, mixed heavily with intense Christian guilt, theatrical penance, and the mandate of self-renunciation.
Heavily colored by Rousseau's romantic, isolating obsession with unique individual feelings.
And finally managed, categorized, and billed by Freud's medicalized scientific requirement to confess everything to a professional. You are all of these things at once.
And that profound realization leaves us with a massive, provocative thought to mull over as we conclude. If the self isn't a fixed biological reality, if it is just a historical construct that is constantly being shaped by the tools, the technologies, and the power structures of its specific era, what is the digital age doing to us right now?
That is the ultimate question. If the Stoics built their sense of self using written diaries and letters, and if the early Christians built their sense of self using the public confessional and absolute monastic obedience, what kind of self are we building today?
Look at the technologies of our era. How are the social media algorithms that constantly feed us tailored content shaping our desires before we even know we have them?
How are the quantified self apps that track our heart rates, our steps, our sleep cycles, reducing our human experience to a dashboard of metrics?
And how is the constant, invisible, accepted digital surveillance of our every click, swipe, and purchase currently inventing a brand new, completely unrecognizable version of the human self?
What kind of self is required to survive in a world where everything you are is converted into data to be analyzed by an artificial intelligence? Is the algorithm the new master? Are we confessing to the machine?
It's a profound, arguably terrifying evolution of Foucault's technologies of the self. And it is happening in real time, right in our pockets every time we look at a screen.
It is the next chapter in the history of the soul.
Truly.
We want to thank you so much for joining us on this incredible, personalized, deep dive today. It's been an absolutely massive journey through time, philosophy, and psychology.
We hope it leaves you with entirely new ways to ponder your own ever-evolving, historically patched together, and utterly fascinating self.
Keep questioning the tools you use to build your life. Until next time.